Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We are delighted that we have a pretty sizable group here for this session this afternoon. My name is James Felton III. I'm the Vice President for the Division of Inclusive Excellence. And turn over to you, Keli. Introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Keli Fazio. I am Department Chair and Associate Professor of Communication Studies.
And today we're going to be talking about improving intergroup relations through intergroup dialogue. I am very excited that Keli has agreed to collaborate and partner on this journey. I have been doing intergroup dialogue work for about 15 years, and I'm hoping that we are able to start an initiative here at TC&J. Keli has been meeting with me pretty regularly for the last, I would say 4 or 5 months, as we've looked at the materials and thought about this presentation today and how we might introduce this topic to our TC&J community. So with that, we're going to go right into the presentation. There will be some time for questions. We'll make it a little interactive for you today as well. So we're going to do an introductory discussion, and then from there we'll go into what exactly intergroup dialogue is. We'll also talk about different models of intergroup dialogue. We'll talk about some of the tenets of a particular methodology known as transformational social therapy. And then we'll also talk about our vision for the intergroup dialogue initiative here again, and then we'll end with a little sample activity and Q&A. So the first thing we want to do is show you a video clip. Some of you may remember the TV show Third Rock from the Sun. And so we just have a clip that we want to show, and then we'll engage in a little Q&A.
Aztec, Toltec, Inca, Inuit, Bedouin, Indian, Sikh. Aztec, Toltec, Inca, Inuit, Bedouin, Indian.
What are you doing at my desk?
Anthropology is fascinating. Such a wealth of cultures. You know, up until now, I always thought that what you did was pointless and of no interest to anyone but yourself.
Well, it's certainly not as fascinating as physics. I mean, everybody loves math. Get away from my desk.
Nina, what is that thing on your head?
It's called a deku.
Oh, I think it's beautiful.
Thank you. It's authentic. It makes me feel connected to my ancestors.
Oh, so that's the traditional headdress of ancient secretaries?
No. Of my African ancestors, in case you haven't noticed, I'm black.
Well, of course I noticed. And, Dr. Albright, you are...
Could I be any whiter?
What?
I'm sorry, all you people look alike to me.
Excuse me?
Nothing. I just don't see why people have to divide up into these arbitrary subsets. I mean, skin color, please. You may see color, but I see people.
Aren't we fortunate to have someone so enlightened? Oh, pious one, show us the way.
This verges on sarcasm.
You know, my heritage happens to be very important to me.
As it should be. I'm Irish, and I'm very proud of that. And you're... what?
Me? I'm one of those, you know, one of the really good ones. Oh, you're this big anthropologist. You tell me, what am I?
Certifiable.
Yes, that's what I am. Certifiable. Certifiable and damn proud of it. As my father was before me, and his father before him, and his father before him. Certifiable. Of course, we no longer practice. You see, Sally, dancing is...
So those of you who might remember that show, the premise is that there is a family of aliens who have come to Earth, and they're trying to assimilate in human culture. So you'll probably appreciate that clip if you go back and watch it again. So given that context, We wanted to start off with a brief discussion. And so if aliens came to our campus at TCNJ, what would they say in terms of intergroup relations on campus? And we can't see everyone, so if someone just wants to jump in. So what would you think someone who is unfamiliar with this campus community, what would they observe or notice on campus?
By way of people or infrastructure, because they can go either way. But if we're talking about people, and I've only been here 9 weeks, everyone, hello, Tikis Davis. I would say that they would notice that there's a large group of alum who work at TCNJ. So people enjoyed their time and were willing to dedicate their efforts to working at this institution. So there's a large population of alum who decide to make TCNJ their career choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think that they would notice a big difference in how different peer groups talk to one another. So students would certainly communicate to one another in a very different tone and attitude than staff and faculty would to one another, and then across peer groups.
Yep, thank you. Okay, let's move on to the next one. What would they identify as our institutional strengths, you think?
I think, hi, this is Catherine. As an institutional strength, I think in general, at face value, people are very friendly, collaborative, open in working with staff and students, particularly students, I think are very open to, at least at face value, a dialogue with whomever they encounter. How deep they go in dialogue, that's another issue. But I think just general surface level, it's a very comfortable and friendly campus.
Yeah, absolutely, thanks. Then the last question, what would they identify as our institutional weaknesses?
Actually, another strength, which I think can be flipped into a weakness, is there is a strong pride and a sense of pride amongst the community at TCNJ. And I think it stems from what Takis mentioned, that you have student body that, of course, is proud and engaged in learning here, but you also have a huge chunk of staff or faculty that were alumni that kind of grew up here. So that sense of pride and belonging is pretty strong. But I think also that can flip as a weakness because the community itself isn't as broad reaching as maybe other communities would be, with people that bring outside interests, talents, backgrounds, educational experiences.
Interesting observation, thanks. All right, and thanks to the whole Division of Inclusive Excellence, I think, for answering those questions. So let's
anytime, VP.
Well, this is Dara. I have a weakness, but it's something I think that's evolving. So there's an interest, there's conversation. There in my classrooms with my students, there is a desire to move forward and to kind of step out of what they've been used to doing. But I think the movement is slower than we would like to action.
So Dara, you're saying there might be a hesitation to engage?
I think they want to, and the conversations, that I am included on with them, is that there is a desire, and the conversations need to, well, the action taken from those conversations is kind of slower than they'd like. They're impatient to be moving forward with certain things that are really important to them. And because there's so many different groups on campus, and there's groups within groups within groups on campus, it can be difficult to move things along in a way that, again, I'm thinking about conversations I've had with students. They'd like to see more movement and faster. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
All right, Kelly, we can go to the next slide. So those introductory questions are what leads us to dialogue, which is a type of interaction and engagement, right? And so this is a national model in higher education that works with students as well as faculty and staff across different cultural differences. And the goal is to foster learning and coalition building with people from different backgrounds who may have historical conflict, if you will. It could be social conflict, it could be cultural conflict, but there's some sense of conflict. It could be personal conflict as well. And so the dialogue methodology, if you will, is an opportunity to have face-to-face facilitated learning experiences. We want to focus on that. That's the key word there is a facilitated learning experience, which is very different than just having a discussion or a debate. Dialogue is a little bit different than those other forms of communication. And so again, we want to bring people together from different identity groups to promote that learning and again, that coalition building. And we center this work around issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. And this work comes from the University of Michigan, which Kelly's going to talk about further in the presentation. But there are some substantive books and readings on intergroup dialogue. The most common one is Zuniga, Nagata, and Chesler, and Clayton Walker.
And the distinction here with intergroup dialogue compared to other methods of cross-group encounters is the depth of the engagement in the dialogue. So it approaches communication with the lens that conflict can be productive, and when done productively can not only avoid violence, but also present as an opportunity for relational growth and enhanced dual perspectives. So some of the feedback, if you read students who have gone through intergroup dialogue, is that the learning process is not easy. It involves disagreements and discomfort, and it can push comfort zones. And for some students, it was the first time they said they explored what a difference between them and another person really meant in terms of anything from life perspectives to cultural expectations, to social, economic, and political inequities too. So intergroup dialogue creates the space for people to learn to talk, think, and feel across those racial, ethnic, and gender differences, while simultaneously kind of unearthing commonalities that exist as well. And there are 3 models of intergroup dialogue that we just want to kind of overview today. And the first one is a clip. James, I don't know if you want to introduce it while I pull it up for the color of fear. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Some of you may still use this film in your classes. This is kind of an oldie or goodie, but this was kind of the first model of intergroup dialogue. Famous film in the 90s by Lin-Manuel, and he is interviewing a group of men at a weekend retreat around their experiences around race. You'll get a taste for what can sometimes happen in a dialogue through this clip.
Ready?
Sort of silent consciousness about what it means to be American that I sense coming from white folks that I'd like to talk about. Before I do that, I'd like to say one more thing that's hard about talking about racism, and that is that people of color are spilling their guts and doing education to white people. Let me explain to you how you've got this wrong. Let me explain to you how you've got that wrong. Let me explain. And then we get cross-examined, and it's like, well, maybe your problem is blah, 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 blah. And it's always, you know, racism gets looked at as a person of color's problem, and it's not. You know, we're like on the receiving end of the problem, but we're not the problem. You know, I walk in a world where black people, where Latinos, where Asians, where Arabs, all these different people are experienced as problem people, and that, well, we're going to deal with the person of color problem, when in fact racism is essentially a white problem. And that for you to understand what racism is about, you're going to be so uncomfortable. You're going to be so different from who you see yourself to be now that you know, there's just no way for you to get it from where you're sitting. And I'm not saying that you could never get it. I mean that that you need to step outside of your skin and step outside of what seems really comfortable and familiar to you, and launch out into some real, for you, unknown territory. And you haven't gone out there like you haven't, you know, gotten in proximity to black people, as you say, because you don't have to. And that's part of what it means to be American, to me, is to have all these things that you can do if you want to, that you don't have to do if you don't want to do. And there's a way in which American and white and human become synonyms. That why can't we just treat each other as human beings? To me, when I hear it from a white person, it means, why can't we all just pretend to be white people? I'll pretend you're a white person, and then you can pretend to be white. Why don't you eat what I eat? Why don't you drink what I drink? Why don't you think like I think? Why don't you feel like I feel? God damn it, I'm so sick and goddamn tired of hearing about that. I'm sick of that. That's what it means to be human being to me. That's what it means to be white. That's what it means to be American. Why don't you come the hell over here? That's what I hear every goddamn day. And you know that I can't come over there. You know that this skin and that this hair and that this way to that talk and that I think and I feel will never, ever get included, because I'm unpalatable to this goddamn nation. I'm unpalatable. You cannot swallow me. You cannot taste me. You cannot feel me because you don't want to. You think that you can survive without me, but you can't, man. You think that, hey, it'll all be fine when we just treat each other like human beings. And what that says to me is, don't be yourself. Be like me. Keep me comfortable. Connect where I'm ready to connect. Come out to my place. Or maybe I'll come down and get some artifacts from your place. That is bullshit. When you say that your ethnicity is American, there is no American ethnicity.
We can stop there,
Keli. Throw away your ethnicity to become American. That's what it means. That's
You're muted, James.
I don't know. Sorry about that. So that is an extreme example of what can happen in terms of conflict that arises in an intergroup dialogue. But we wanted to show you that as that is a documentary style where there are people observing, people having those types of conversations, those deep-seated conversations around cultural differences. So that's the first example.
And the second model, which we'll dive deeper into in the next few slides, is the program founded at the University of Michigan. And the Michigan model was founded in 1988, and since then, a number of schools conduct annual intergroup dialogues utilizing that program. This is schools like University of Maryland, Washington, UMass, Arizona State. Under that model, the aim is for participants to construct new meanings together, build alliances, and move to action. And then finally, the Temple University model shows some of the foundational tenets of the intergroup dialogue. However, it works in this idea of transformational social therapy, which is really interesting. And we're going to unpack that as well later on in the presentation. But just as a quick deep dive into the Michigan model, this is one of the more prominent, well-known models in terms of intergroup dialogue. And structurally, there are 16 individuals divided into these groups across 4 groups, with groups consisting of women of color, white women, men of color, and white men. And 2 trained facilitators, one from each identity group, lead 26 contact hours. So to put that into perspective, that's more than half of the meeting time of a regular semester long course at TCNJ. So this is really a sustained interaction. And during this process, readings convey to participants new knowledge about the historical and the social context of the particular group's oppression. And intergroup dialogue differs from other diversity education programs because it focuses on both the cognitive and the affective dimensions. So while readings provide that conceptual framework, participants learn primarily through personal and group sharing. So what happens in these dialogues? And one of the big distinctions here is that it's a movement from, a movement towards dialogue, which is distinguished really clearly from debates and discussions. So in debates, the outcome or the goal is winning a lot of times. It has the implication of a conclusion, rather than this dynamic interaction that can happen. In discussions, the impression can be more of, the more the perspectives that are voiced, the better. And communication strategies and discussions are often to listen to respond or to listen to insert our own perspective. And while it can promote or encourage individual sharing, it at times is at the expense of listening to or inquiring about others' perspectives as well. Dialogue, on the other hand, is open-ended in nature. We listen to understand. It creates an openness to learning from mistakes and biases. The goal is to not alienate and finding a common ground as the end result here. So the Michigan model really prioritizes that dialogue in contrast to other models. What's unique about the Michigan model specifically is that it is peer facilitated. So in this case, they're training students to run student peer groups. And they have 2 trained facilitators per group of 16, and the facilitators are trained in self-awareness, including awareness of their own social identity in the context of systems of domination and privilege, of oppression and exclusion. And they also get a lot of training in terms of group work, group process, community building, and dialogue. They are trained by courses at the University of Michigan. So there's I guess a theory type course, and then there's a practicum for this. They have a lot of curriculum around it as well, and they go through a lot of supervision with their own facilitators for the program that teach them to engage in a lot of the exercises that we're going to talk about in terms of the steps that they go through. So they'll go through those exercises themselves in a lot of these supervised trainings, and then they go and in turn use them and apply them to the group of 16. So the Michigan model has 4 stages. The first is about forming and building relationships, which focuses on creating a shared meaning of dialogue. So this is group formation, trust building, and participants learn the distinctions between dialogue and debate here. So the conversations in the stage acknowledge individuals' multiple identities and the particular identity that will be at the forefront of those dialogic sessions. And the second stage focuses more on identity and social relations and conflict. So it'll invite participants to examine identities in terms of both themselves, but their relations and their groups as well. Material in this stage works through both intergroup and intergroup differences and similarities. And this is where really the privilege and discrimination get kind of that deep dive, particularly when groups are comprised of people with greater or lesser degrees of privilege. So this stage is examining kind of structural racism and related social justice issues. That third stage is about hot topics. So these are real world issues that tend to be divisive in nature. One of the paramount lessons of this phase is the idea of groups rallying together must extend beyond just the allyship of friends. And it's also imperative to focus on allying together when self-interests actually differ. So these hot topics often produce divisions and provide those opportunities for participants to work through those conflicts. Some of the questions from this stage could be, how can we be in a community together even when someone else's perspective on a topic hurts me or irritates me? Can I still listen to you and remain in dialogue mode? with you, even during moments when I'm really upset by your viewpoint. And then that stage 4 moves into potential action steps for alliances. So this is what I think is really cool about, this intergroup dialogue in general, is this idea that you're taking these conversations and then having kind of action steps and movements in terms of allyship here. How can groups work together productively? How would that look? How can it be helpful or productive? What are going to be some obstacles? What are the specific action steps we need to take, down to the details, to move together in a positive manner? So it's a matter of kind of moving participants beyond the insights gained and using it to build beyond their new understandings. So the Michigan model is the primary version in terms of what started the kind of these foundational courses in intergroup dialogue. But Temple University has since kind of created their own take on this as well. And James is going to jump into this too. But basically, this is a hybrid version of this, where they're using some of the core assumptions of the Michigan model, but they're adding in transformational social therapy, which we'll give some insight to in detail. But it's basically a tool that is really shown to assist practitioners in overcoming their own fears of authentic expression. So we have this overcompensation for safety, along with various rules and the procedures that go along with that. And that might limit participants from fully engaging themselves in this process towards collective action. So the Temple model helps to address some of that. And then another hybrid model is the Western Carolina University. And we're not going to go too deep into that today. James might touch on it a little bit more, but there's different versions of how intergroup dialogue exists at different universities and colleges across campus. And these are kind of the 3 that we can outline today.
So there are a number of considerations that you want to take into account when you're thinking about establishing a dialogue program on campus or even in the community. So you have to identify, obviously, the who, when, and why you're going to offer these dialogues. So there are a number of the models that we talked about briefly that offer them in a curriculum format. There are some that offer them as part of a student leadership experience, most commonly in student affairs programs. There are also a number of community-based intergroup dialogue programs. And then, of course, there are dialogue programs offered for professional development. One of the dialogues that we actually did, well, I've started 4 dialogue programs at various institutions. At one particular institution, we did actually 2 community dialogues as part of our campus-based community. There was a cross burning 2 towns over from the university where I was at the time. And the school asked us to work with the family in the community and holding a dialogue on race and racism. There was another example where we had a member of our dialogue committee who was a Wiccan, and the individual's brother was transitioning from male to female, and so that was an interesting. There's lots of different coming of age traditions and ceremonies that happen in the Wiccan community. That was very off-putting for the Temple. And so we actually held an intergroup dialogue on transgender identity for a Wiccan community. So just think about that and ponder on that for a second, just in terms of the many types of and various ways that you can offer intergroup dialogue and the types of discussions that you can have. So that would be an important factor to consider. The other is what is the type of facilitation and curriculum. So similar to the Michigan model, as Keli mentioned, we value the importance in the Philadelphia area of folks who do this work on having 2 co-facilitators and making sure that we vary a little bit from the Michigan model, in which they have very specific set of races and ethnicities that they want to enroll in those classes in order to make that run. For many of us who are doing this work, again, out of the Philadelphia area, everyone's voice is important. So if we're having a dialogue on gender and there's only one cisgendered identifying male in the room, it doesn't matter. We'll still run that. That person's voice and experiences is just as valid and important as everyone else's in the room. So there's lots of ways to think about how you facilitate and develop curriculum around dialogues. The other thing I'll say about curriculum too is that you can have one and done kind of dialogue sessions, or you can have sustained dialogues, as Keli mentioned. So Michigan model obviously does it over a course of a semester. I know that there have been some programs where they've happened over a course of a year. In fact, the Temple group actually ran a course on Amore for couples. So it was a whole year-long intergroup dialogue for couples and partners who were having some sources of conflict, and were able to share that with other couples in the particular space. Some other important considerations in the facilitation specifically that we want to be mindful of are the role of emotions in facilitation. And this shows up a lot. And so one of the things that I value so much about the Philadelphia group is that we still practice our craft. We get together just to dialogue for the sake of dialogue and for the sake of being better facilitators, and making sure that we develop a strong sense of trust and authenticity in the work that we're doing. We could get up and just facilitate for the sake of facilitating, but sometimes you can tell the difference between someone who's present and someone who's here. And so there are a number of emotions that we work on and through our facilitation training. So I'll give you an example. When I started doing facilitation, one of the big emotions that I had to contend with was abandonment. And so it's very easy to turn folks off if they're, they're indifferent. You don't agree necessarily with the conflict that it's being addressed or raised. And so as a facilitator, you have to make sure that you're on all the time, right? And you can't kind of show your cards in terms of, whether you agree or disagree with that person. And so what I would do is sometimes just shut down altogether. And then I would have my co-facilitator kind of nudge me or give me some kind of, gesture that says, hey, get back into this, right? We're doing this together. And so that's just one of several emotions that we talk about in terms of making sure that you're a good facilitator and you're, really, helping to engage that space or that circle or community. The role of conflict, as Keli mentioned earlier, in facilitation is important. So we showed the color of fear example, and obviously that might be, very intimidating for some of the folks here in the room, right? And so how do you manage that? How do you mitigate that? And all conflict is not bad, as Keli said, right? So there could be good conflict, bad conflict, and just conflict in general. But you have to make sure that you're always mindful of how are you managing that role as a facilitator when issues of conflict arise. As I mentioned earlier, authenticity. It's important for facilitators to share their experiences around these issues of race and ethnicity and other forms of diversity that are part of the modules for intergroup dialogue. That is how you build trust and engage trust of the members who are participating in your modules. Masking emotions is obviously something you want to be mindful of as well. So you don't want to put on a mask and just do a checkbox in terms of running a dialogue. You want to make sure that people feel like you're in this as well and that you're learning and taking something away and being challenged at the same time. So there's a lot of vulnerability that's involved with folks who want to be facilitators. They have to be part of the process. And then the continual development of facilitation skills. As I mentioned earlier, the Temple group gets together, once or twice a month, and we're just, we do potlucks and we get share spaces in people's homes, and we just have dialogue. And then we then debrief on, what was said and shared as part of that process. So we talked briefly a little bit about the Temple University certificate model. I won't go through this whole entire slide, but transformational social therapy is what kind of sets the Philadelphia group from the Michigan model and some of the other hybrid models that are out there. This has transformed me in terms of who I am as an individual and what I bring to intergroup dialogue. And we've been fortunate enough for the past 10 years to work with a French psychotherapist, Dr. Charles Rosman, who has 20 years of plus years of experience working with dialogue at the most severe levels. So he's been like literally on the ground in war-torn countries. He's worked in Kosovo, Israel, and Rwanda. He served as an advisor to the UN, and he has actually engaged in conflict where people were about to literally kill each other around cultural differences. And so he has been amazing in terms of his ability to educate others, kind of in a train-the-trainer model, if you will, in terms of how do we, again, manage those emotions and those conflicts when they arise, and how do we think about healthy transformation around those issues of conflict. And the big thing that he stresses is the harmonization of motivations. So as Keli mentioned before, dialogue is different from a debate and discussion. And so the goal is not to try to change someone's viewpoint or mindset or opinions. It's really how do we share space with folks who we may have commonalities as well as differences, but then how do we move forward knowing what those commonalities and differences are so that we can be our true authentic selves. And, you know, I asked that to everyone in this room, what would it look like if we could all come to TCNJ every day as our true authentic selves and be able to challenge folks and engage folks in healthy, productive ways when there are those diversity oops and ouches that come up, right? Sometimes we just stay silent, or we're, you know, fearful that we're gonna, you know, stereotype someone or marginalize them. And what Dr. Rosman says is, no, we don't need to walk on eggshells. We need to engage the conflict, because if we don't engage the conflict, then we're more likely to engage in social violence, and not violence in the physical sense, but violence in terms of denying people opportunities, maybe for advancement, to be included in circles where it could be beneficial for our learning and our success. There are many different ways to think about social violence, but he says that we have to engage conflict in order to be transformational and move together in productive ways. So again, Rosman says we can't change people, but people will change if they're motivated to do so. And so again, that awareness of the lack of trust and fears and prejudices are part of conflicts that come up in dialogues. And when you see those, when you're heightenedly aware of the lack of trust and those fears and prejudices, you shouldn't mask over them. You should engage them. Let me go to the next slide. So our vision for intergroup dialogue at TCNJ is to create an innovative hybrid model similar to Temple University and Western Carolina University. Western Carolina and Temple don't use students as the Michigan model does. We have trained faculty and staff, or professionals, if you will, who are the facilitators, and they run modules separately for, or respectively, I should say, for students and then employees. We could also think about a model where we're also doing this work in the local community as well. Again, as it says, they're trained college and community facilitators who are able to hold multiple dialogues on campus throughout the county. And so again, we can think about that through K through 12 systems. We could think about it for corporations. We could also think about it through human service agencies and grassroots organizations. So there's no limit in terms of who we could, you know, partner with in terms of our stakeholders for this work. And then finally, we want to develop a proven diversity initiative that will result in positive social change among the members of the college and the surrounding community. And so as we have talked a lot over the past year about inclusion and about anti-racism, this is one methodology. It's not the only way, but it's one way that we can work towards that positive social change. So we're going to start do a little activity as the facilitators of this session and kind of model what would happen in a dialogue. And so One of the steps in dialogue is to develop formations and orientation around the particular topic that you are going to dialogue about. And so if we were having, for example, an intergroup dialogue on gender, one of the things that we might do as an activity is to ask this following question. When was the first time you could remember experiencing gender and or being gendered? And so I'll volunteer myself. When I was 4 years old, I remember having a big plastic tote that my parents bought me. And I placed all my action figures in there. I had over 100 action figures at one point in time. And my weekend ritual was to just dump that tote in the middle of the living room floor. And I would just throw my action figures all over the place. And I'd just be in the middle of the floor rolling around and in my glory for, a couple hours every Saturday morning. Something occurred to me one particular weekend. I looked across the room and I saw my mom straddling my sister in the chair. My sister was on the floor and she was combing her hair and braiding her hair. And I didn't realize what was happening there, but there was something to me that said, oh, wow, I get to do whatever I want. And my sister has to demonstrate this great restraint to get her hair done. And I looked at myself and said, I don't have hair like that either. So that's where I kind of noticed there was a difference between my sister and myself and my first encounter with gender. Keli, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. When James asked this, I had to think about one of the first the first gendered experience I recalled. I was thinking of them throughout schooling, but I think the first one for me was, in first grade, the school I went to had uniforms and I was a really active child. I played a lot of sports. I loved it. It was my outlet. It's where I felt the most me. But the uniforms were very different for girls and boys. And I remember being in recess and being outside and running around, how frustrated I'd get. And my mom would encourage me to ask all the time if I could wear the boys' uniforms. And I did over and over again. But that was something that was kind of my first realization that there was a structure in place that I had to kind of abide to. And that there were differences for the boys and girls at that age.
Thanks for sharing that, Keli. Mm-hmm. So we thought we'd open it up to the group and get a couple of examples from our participants. When was the first time that you remember experiencing gender or being gendered?
This is Dara. I'm happy to go. I grew up with two sisters, so there were 3 girls and 1 boy in our family, and I grew up in the 70s, and it was pretty early on as we were going out and doing things. My brother is about 2 years younger than me, and he's kind of in the middle of the 4 of us, and he had different times. He could go out and stay out, and he didn't have to come in when we did. As we grew up, we also weren't able to go out to concerts or things like that. He was much younger when he was allowed to do that, and it was based on the fact that he was a boy, and we were higher at risk. At least that was the explanation in my family. So it was pretty early on in my family with the 4 of us.
Thanks, Dara, for sharing.
Yeah.
Keli, maybe we stop sharing the screen.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, that would be, thank you. I think we have a hand raised too. I just lost.
Yep, I think it's Hafsa.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Hafsa. I'm a student. So the first time I thought about gender was, I think I was around 4 or 5. My dad used to do all my shopping, and he'd only, moved to the US for a few years before I was born. So he didn't really have the concept of the men's section or the boys section and the girls section. So we used to buy all my clothes, or some of my clothes, from the boys section, and I liked it. I liked blue and orange and those traditionally masculine colors. And it never like occurred to me that I was shopping in the boy section until this boy in my class and I were wearing the same clothes one day. And then somebody made fun of me and I was like, what? Like, it didn't make any sense. And I was like, oh, I'm not supposed to be wearing this. It's like a boy's shirt and it had like cars or whatever on it. And that was the first time I like realized I have to kind of dress the part. And I can't just, you know, dress how I want because of those gender norms.
Great, thank you, Hafsa. Who else has a memory they'd like to share?
Judy.
Yeah, Judy.
Hi, everyone. Similarly to some of the examples that have been given, my early memory has to do with a sibling and noticing the difference between the kind of toys that were provided for my brother versus the kind of toys that were provided for me. And I had a lot of dolls and pink, and he seemed to have a lot of construction toys, and I wanted to play with his Legos, and he wanted to play with my dolls. He was allowed to have one doll, which was a Dapper Dan, which was very, you know, this was clearly a boy doll, you know, in the 70s. But just wondering why there was such a difference and why we had, you know, different options.
Thanks, Judy.
Thanks, Judy. We have a chat, James. Katie says being labeled a tomboy and different because I enjoyed playing with toads and being outdoors at about 4 to 5 years old.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, I'll share something that's multi-generational. When I was a little girl, my father was the Cub Scouts pack leader. And I have a brother who's a year older than me. So I would participate in some of the pack meetings and they were a lot of fun. You know, there would be 60 or 70 kids broken up into groups and they did all sorts of cool stuff. And I was allowed to be a part of it as a sibling and as his daughter. But then when I went to Girl Scouts, I was extremely disappointed. It was not nearly as much fun, and I was not nearly as engaged. Fast forward a long time, I have a young daughter who is joining the Cub Scouts. She joined 2 weeks ago. We were invited and I said, you know, I think you should try Cub Scouts, and nobody's invited her to Girl Scouts yet, and I'm not pushing it.
Great.
Thank you, Denise. I see in the chat, Kelly, as well, that Gracia said that, Katie, I had a similar experience of being a tomboy. Tomboy was my middle name. And then Krista said that sitting at my grandmother's sewing machine, as she thought I needed to learn how to sew, while my siblings were outside playing in the woods. I much rather preferred to be outside playing in the woods. So great. Oh, anyone else want to go? Yeah.
Hi, excuse me, this is Audrey. I have like a different recollection. I have a recollection of a relative visiting and we were in a store and she wanted to purchase something for me. And, you know, she was directing me towards the dolls and it wasn't really what I wanted. And my mother always trying to have us be as open-minded as we could. When I reflect back now, I remember her specifically saying, Audrey, you don't have to pick out a doll. You know, there's other things you could pick out. So I had, from an early time in my life, I feel fortunate, parents who were trying to, and I'm older than most people on the screen, so I feel grateful and fortunate. And I remember feeling sometimes different than other kids because we were given more choices. And my mother tried not to have that stereotype of different rules for my brother. And I'm not being judgmental of other people who had that experience, but I'm expressing, I guess, gratitude for the experience that I did have.
Yeah, absolutely, Audrey. Thank you.
I can share maybe an experience as well, which actually echoes a lot of the other ones. I grew up in a very gendered and culturally gendered household, and being the oldest, I was responsible for all my siblings. I had to clean, I had to iron, I had to make all the beds while my brother got to do whatever. And I just remember being very angry, and he got to go to the racetrack, and I, like, why can't I go too? And that kind of persisted throughout until I kind of left that household. There was just such a ingrained gender divide, but I couldn't understand, why couldn't I like cars too? I kind of retaliated, bought my own sports car now, and been on the track now, and people will still ask me, did your daddy buy that car for you? So it still persists.
Thank you, Wahida.
We have one more chat, James. Denise said, Krista, I had a similar experience. Mom insisted I had to learn how to iron, specifically men's button-down shirts. I argued it was more important for my brother to learn that than me.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing that.
Thank you.
You know, it's just, I love doing this because, you know, we just took just a couple of minutes to share some things about ourselves that we really don't have an opportunity in the day-to-day, unless we're close colleagues with each other, to have those exchanges. And it was nice to hear the variety of experiences. Some were positive, some were neutral, some were a source of conflict, and maybe even anger and pain for folks that still persists to this day. And so it's healthy to have these conversations, these types of dialogues, where we're able to engage each other again in authentic, meaningful ways, so that we get to learn about each other a little deeper, and we become better colleagues. We become better, you know, partners at home. We become better friends, better family members. But there is so much more that we could dive into. You know, if we had a 3-hour session, it could even be an hour session just on gender, but you know, it would be great if you had a 6-week session where you're meeting and doing this, and there's lots more activities that can be involved in it. So I think we'll stop there, and we will entertain any questions or comments that folks had about this session or about intergroup dialogue in general.
I saw Anne.
Thank you.
Oh, there you
Thank
are.
you so much. This is super interesting. I'm really interested in learning more. A few years ago, we did sustained dialogue here on campus, and I was a facilitator. And I thought that it went very well. I was disappointed that it wasn't continued. But I just wondered, like, what is your vision? Like, there's so many questions. Like, is this going to be for credit for students? How, like, I felt like people really poured their hearts out that semester, and then maybe not that much change happened as a result, and people felt pretty frustrated afterward. And so I'm just wondering, like, how you envision this working at TCNJ.
It's a great question, Anne. So similar to some of the other initiatives that I've started at my previous institutions, very similar to the Philadelphia group, it's important to continue to be engaged. And so if we were to start a committee here at TCNJ, it would be comprised of a couple of things. First and foremost is the opportunity to identify dialogues or spaces for dialogue. So it could be anything from maybe it's an FSP to it's just professional development that we provide for ourselves. So I think that's the first piece of it is, you know, how we identify those spaces. It could be the community as well. And the second thing is the facilitation training itself. And so Kelly and I are very interested in hosting a training, perhaps over the winter break. And so we will probably finalize some dates with some of my colleagues from the Philadelphia region very soon, and then make an announcement about that. So it might be a 1 day or a day and a half kind of facilitation training, but that would allow folks to really do a deep dive into dialogue work. And it would give us a foundation in which we can then continue to meet throughout the course of the academic year, kind of honing our craft and then thinking about when we're ready to actually engage in facilitation. And then the third piece, because everyone's not comfortable facilitating, nor should we force people to facilitate, is to really think about the strategic elements of this. So again, could there be some curricular opportunities to develop courses around this? Could there be an opportunity for folks who don't want to facilitate, but they're really good at doing curriculum? And if we were thinking about sustained dialogue models, that they're developing the curriculum for a 3 month, 6 week, whatever the time length that we want to do. And if they have a particular level of expertise in one of the areas of the various modules for dialogue. So that vision would kind of be threefold in terms of just identifying opportunities to practice and hold dialogue, facilitation skills, which would be ongoing, and then kind of the logistic piece in terms of the curriculum and the offerings on campus. Hopefully that answered your question, Ann.
Thank you.
And I see that Dara and Krista have already expressed interest, so we are making note of that.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments? Thanks, Seth. I see you too. And Kitty as well. Excellent. So we already got a committee for him. That's great. Excellent. Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Ann. I'm excited.
Me too. James, I'd have a quick question for you that I haven't gotten to ask yet. I saw that there's like an annual conference as well. Is that a conference to train facilitators, or is it just something that you can regularly attend? What is that?
That's a great question, Kelly. So there is an annual conference on Intergroup Dialogue. It is mainly made up of the consortium schools that practice the Michigan model. But in recent years, it's been opened up to any institution that has any type of, as Ann said, sustained dialogue, difficult conversations. There's various names and methods for them. So that's an opportunity to hone your craft as a facilitator, but also hear about what's happening curricularly and co-curricularly on different campuses around their initiatives. So just as we talked about the curriculum piece, that would be the annual conference would be an opportunity for faculty and folks who teach to be able to come together and talk about how do we embed this in the classroom or make it part of the curricular offerings. There could be student affairs folks who are there who are then meeting and thinking about it from a leadership perspective. For example, I'll just pick on Seth. We might have, intergroup dialogue as maybe part of an application process for our students, who are gonna, be our resident. I forget what we call them here, so excuse me. Turns from my head, not to our heart, but
community advisors.
Community advisors, thank you, or CA. So, so that you might do that, and you might look for certain things in that, and that as an opportunity for how to help your CAs then engage conflict in the res halls. So there's lots of different ways that in conversations that can be had at that annual conference.
Thank you.
And Alex, if you would record the chat, that would be great, because we've got lots of people that are interested.
I've got the names too. I think I have everyone. We'll check it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, Kelly, any closing remarks you want to make?
No, thank you for sharing this with me. I think James has shared so many resources, you know, from the programming he's done at other schools. And it was really inspiring to read through it and see how things have evolved, and how, you know, just how they're working in different schools. And I think the outcomes seem just really exciting. And as a background, as a communication scholar, just finding ways to really get at the nuance of how we engage is something that I think can make a really big difference. So it's just been exciting to be able to learn about it all. So thank you for that.
And thank you, Keli, again, for your interest in for collaborating and partnering on this. We'd like to thank you all for spending your Friday afternoon with us. And you'll see more information in the following weeks to come. So take care and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.